Okay, well, as the last few stragglers come in and the hush descends, I would just like to say welcome to all of you from the School of Politics and International Relations at Queen Mary University of London. I'm here because we're lucky enough to have Andrew Adonis as a visiting professor in our school. We're incredibly pleased to have someone of his stature, someone who is equally at home in the university as he is in political life and in so many other aspects of what he does. He's an incredible asset to the university, to our students, and to the faculty. We're pleased to be able to say that Andrew will be giving his inaugural lecture as a visiting professor with us at Queen Mary sometime in the autumn, date to be announced. So it only really remains for me to say that these proceedings are open and to hand over to the proper chair of the event, and that's John Rentoul. John.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tim. I'm John Rentoul, and I've been associated with the Mile Group since, I'm told, meeting number 6 in 2004, which was all about how it was the right wing of the Labour Party that saved the Labour Party back in the 1980s, which was the sort of fun that we've been having at Mile Group meetings for 10 years now, and more. So this is Mile Group meeting number 105. In association with Tim's politics department, which is doing fantastic things at Queen Mary, really extending the East End PPE, as we like to call it, really pushing politics as a academic qualification in the East End. I'm not allowed to speak for more than about 30 seconds, but I've got to say thank you to the supporters of the Mile Group, Hewlett-Packard and the City of London Corporation, and a huge thank you obviously to Canary Wharf Group for providing us with this fantastic view of the Saharan dust. Andrew Adonis has been one of my heroes for a very long time. I've just been reading Roy Jenkins's biography, or the biography of Roy Jenkins by John Campbell, which is a fantastic book. I have to recommend it to everyone, even if you hate Roy Jenkins as much as I do. But this is the book that was going to be written by Andrew Adonis, and it's fascinating to see how he appears in its pages as one of Roy Jenkins's many talent-spotted rising stars. Andrew Adonis is like Roy Jenkins in the sense that he has huge energy and drive and is able to do things in politics rather than just go through it with some clever words. Andrew Adonis, with the Academies programme, I think was possibly one of the most important achievements of 13 years of Labour government. And for a politician who wasn't even elected in a constituency, I think that is quite a remarkable achievement. And our other speakers are, we've got Heza, of course, who needs again no introduction, who'll be responding. Is another of those sort of politicians who left monuments, and we're sitting in one of Lord Heseltine's monuments now. And Professor Tony Travers, if he ever gets here, which I'm told it's a constitutional requirement that he's always late. Is another of these brilliant people that really make a huge difference to the worlds in which they move. So allow me to introduce Andrew Adonis.
Thank you. This, to your right, is an amazing view. We look down on the world's greatest city, and we see layer upon layer of our history. In this lecture, I want to look at London's more recent past, over the last 350 years since Christopher Wren, and I want to ask the question, what next? But some thank yous to start with. to Queen Mary's and the Mile End Group, brilliantly led by John Davis, for asking me here, to Sir George Acabescu and the Canary Wharf Group for so generously hosting, to Professor John Rentoul for chairing, and of course to Michael Heseltine and Tony Travers, nicknamed on Twitter I saw as the Mike Tyson and George Foreman of London policy. My title is Two Futures for London, and my argument is this. As our population grows by 100,000 a year, with intense pressure to expand towards 10 million over the next 2 decades, we face a choice. The choice is between patch and mend or radical reform to make a city of 10 million possible and desirable. Edmund Burke famously said, "People will not look forward to posterity who never look backward to their ancestors." So I've been delving into the history of London since Christopher Wren, and it's clear to me that when London has expanded successfully in the past, there has always been a plan. There's this notion that we English don't do big-time planning. Paris has its Haussmann, Barcelona its Gaudi, but London's piecemeal, even where the results are individually dramatic, like St Paul's or Tower Bridge or Canary Wharf. Which is why, goes the argument, we've got an international airport in the wrong place, railway termini which don't join up, a north circular but no real south circular, tall buildings at random, and in amenities, a city of parishes and boroughs yielding one postcode lottery after another. But I don't think this story is the right one. Rather, from Wren to Ken, when London has expanded successfully and dealt with its problems, it has been driven by reformers with big plans. By contrast, when it has failed, be it the slums of the past or the overcrowding of today, reformers have either been absent or powerless, and it's been patch and mend at best. 3 periods of reform are especially striking. After the Great Fire, the century before the First World War, and the last 25 years. In each era, the big challenges were met by big reforms. We all know that after the Great Fire, Wren's St Paul's rose like a phoenix. What I hadn't realised was that after the fire of 1666, which destroyed 12,000 homes, making 1 in 5 Londoners homeless, a debate about the rebuilding of the city raged almost as intensely as had the fire itself. Wren proposed a complete redesign, wide radial streets superimposed on a grid, not just a new cathedral, but churches and new institutions galore, all built in brick or stone, not wood, and a huge new quay fronting the Thames. This would make London, in Wren's own words, the most convenient city for trade in the world. Wren's mentor, the royalist John Evelyn, proclaimed Charles II a second Augustus who would make London a new Rome with Wren his Vitruvius, positively Boris-esque in grandiosity. Parliament rejected Wren's full scheme as too costly and too dictatorial. But in rebuilding the city, much of Wren's planning was adopted. As well as St Paul's and more than 50 new churches, all the rebuilding was in brick and stone. The streets were widened and paved, gradients reduced, and the waterfront raised. It was a stride out of medievalism, an extension of the standards of the new estates in Westminster and its outskirts. For the first time since the Romans, it was possible to walk along a street in the city without being forced out to avoid a pillar, a buttress, or a whole house projecting out. So Wren succeeded, and London entered the 18th century as one of the most convenient cities in the world for trade. Moving on to the century before the First World War, London's population rose at an astonishing rate from 1 million to 7.5 million. 7.5 million. That's only a little below today's level, almost a century later. Best known are the National Railway pioneers, Brunel, Stephenson, et al. And by the way, London's unconnected rail termini were actually planned that way by a royal commission, no less, which in the 1840s banned main lines from the centre. However, when it comes to the development of the capital itself, it is 4 other bold reformers who stand out. John Nash and Joseph Bazalgette, amazing in the scale and sweep of their vision and their ability to implement it, and 2 extraordinary Americans, George Peabody, whose trust invented modern social housing, and Charles Yerkes, who forged the London Underground. John Nash is famous for his stucco terraces and the Regent Street curve, but what I hadn't realised is that these were but part of a vision to rebuild and extend central London on an imperial scale, which was largely implemented. In 1810, when Nash got going, what is now Regent's Park was a dairy farm. Nash persuaded the Prince Regent to turn it into a large pleasure park, and the classiest housing estate London had ever known. It became what we see today, including the zoo. But that was only the start. Regent's Park became the northern end of a new broad road, bordered by similarly grand establishments, cutting a swathe through Old Westminster to Pall Mall, ending up at a grandly remodelled Buckingham Palace, a reinvented St James's Park, and a great central circus, today's Trafalgar Square. We all walk these roads. Park Crescent leads on to Nash's Portland Place and Langham Place. His All Souls Church embellishes the kink in the road as it proceeds to his Regent Street, and his famous curve intended for shops appropriated to articles of fashion and taste for the aristocracy. Then on to his large circus, Piccadilly Circus, and Lower Regent Street, complete with his Haymarket Theatre, leading down to Waterloo Place, Pall Mall, and what became Trafalgar Square. After the demolition of the Prince Regent's Carlton House, Nash added Carlton House Terrace and Clarence House to the design, leading up to his Buckingham Palace. St James's Park he transformed from an unattractive swamp into today's gem. Nash, says one historian, prepared London to become the world's first great metropolis and capital of the world's greatest empire. Not that he got much thanks. The Prince Regent's profligacy was wildly unpopular, and on his death, Nash was sacked. And when Nash died 5 years later, his coffin apparently had to be smuggled into church at night for burial to escape creditors intending to seize it as some bizarre form of security. 25 years later, Joseph Bazalgette was less ostentatious than Nash, but equally transformational. Before reading up on him, I knew that Bazalgette had constructed sewers, and I once glanced at the modest plaque to him on Embankment. But I had no idea that he built more of London than anyone else before or since. He was responsible for Victoria Embankment, reclaiming 37 acres from the Thames and including a road above ground, space for the district line below, and a main sewer below that. Also, the Chelsea and Albert embankments, dozens of new central London streets and thoroughfares, including Northumberland Avenue, Shaftesbury Avenue, Charing Cross Road and Southwark Street, 3 Thames crossings, Tower Bridge, the Blackwall Tunnel and the Woolwich Ferry, and numerous parks, including Battersea Park and Finsbury Park. But the sewers are the most extraordinary part of the story. The coming together of a reformer, a crisis, and a new city government with the power and will to solve it. The crisis was the 1850s sewage crisis, which had been building for decades as population increased, while the means of dealing with its waste didn't. In the 1850s, this became a crisis for an unlikely reason: the introduction of the flushing water closet. Before Mr. Crapper and his ilk, there were cesspools under houses, emptied by night soilmen, who shovelled out the contents, loaded it onto carts, and sold it as fertiliser. This system had long been inadequate, but it broke down completely after the WC was exhibited to huge popularity at the Great Exhibition of 1851. Hundreds of thousands of WCs were rapidly installed in the years immediately afterwards. Now, the problem with the WC was that it flooded the cesspools, making it necessary to connect the cesspools to the street sewers, which couldn't cope and anyway entered the raw sewage into the rivers, turning the Thames and other rivers into foul, brown, stinking open sewers. One of the effects was cholera. 30,000 Londoners, 30,000, died in successive cholera epidemics by the late 1850s. In the face of these horrors, governments dithered and committees waffled, while the responsible civic body, the Metropolitan Sewers Commission, did nothing. Then came a key reform, the establishment of the Metropolitan Board of Works in 1855, with Bazalgette as its chief engineer. But even then, it was another 3 years until the hot summer of 1858 produced a Thames stink so bad that Parliament practically evacuated before Bazalgette was finally empowered to act. But act he did, a 1,100-mile network of street sewers feeding into 82 miles of main sewers. To put that in context, the proposed Thames Tideway tunnel is just 16 miles. The main sewers converged into 4 huge pumping stations to lift the sewage into the 2 largest treatment works in Europe, at Barking and Crossness, and all of this took 17 years to complete amid extraordinary engineering feats. After Bazalgette, there was no more cholera, and London's population growth accelerated even faster. And 150 years later, we are still utterly reliant on his sewers. But sanitation was only the start. Then, as now, there was a housing crisis and insufficient public transport. Enter 2 pioneering Americans, George Peabody and Charles Yerkes. John Nash had built mansions for the aristocracy, and Thomas Cubitt went on to do a similarly transformational job for London's professionals and the aspiring middle classes in Clapham, Bloomsbury, Highbury and Pimlico. But who was going to replace the slums with new model working class housing? George Peabody has been called the father of modern philanthropy. Dispensing his immense Anglo-American banking fortune, he set up a trust to provide decent housing for artisans and the labouring poor. His first estate opened in Spitalfields in 1864, soon followed by others in Islington, Poplar, Shadwell, Chelsea, Westminster and Bermondsey. Within 20 years, his Peabody Trust was housing 15,000, and the modern concept of large-scale social housing was born. The pre-1900 Peabody estates all had the same architect, Henry Derbyshire. His tenement blocks were spacious, 5 or 6 stories high, with good internal sanitation, separated to allow adequate ventilation, with central play areas for the children, and surrounding railings and gates shut at 11 p.m. to keep the right people in and out. Today, the Peabody Trust houses 70,000 Londoners, nearly 1% of London's population, and it's planning to add 10,000 more in Thamesmead alone. The other American, Charles Yerkes, was less reputable, a thoroughly shady, at one stage imprisoned, Philadelphia financier. But his imprint was just as great as the creator of the London Underground in 1902. Although the subsurface Metropolitan line had been started back in 1863, the breakthrough for crisscrossing central London with commuter trains was the combination of electric traction and deep tunnelling technology. These came together in the opening of the world's first tube line, Bank to Stockwell, in 1890. Yerkes, fresh from building much of Chicago's elevated loop in the quest for a profitable monopoly, saw a similar opportunity in London. Moving here in 1900, he bought out the short existing stretches within what are now the Bakerloo, Northern, Piccadilly and District lines, set up the Underground Electric Railways Company of London, and within just 5 years before his death in 1905, he got most of these lines, the core of today's tube network, under construction. Together with the Metropolitan and Central lines, this gave London the world's first, biggest and best underground metro system of the early and mid-20th century. And to put that in context, in the 70 years since 1945, only 1.5 new underground lines have been built, the Victoria Line and the Jubilee Line extension. And as the Metropolitan Line extended into the northwest suburbs in the 1920s, its parent company built suburban housing estates all along the line from Wembley Park to Amersham and Chesham, plus apparently 18 golf courses. This is a rare case of a major railway promoter building both a railway and housing to serve it, and it may be a model for the future. To the third and final reform era, the recent past. The immediate post-World War II decades were an era of London decline, though it should be stressed, which fits into my wider argument, that this was largely planned decline. The Abercrombie Plan of 1944 deliberately planned to diminish London by relocating part of its population and industry. Abercrombie succeeded only too well over the next 40 years, as population fell by 2 million and inner London went into a serious decline, far beyond anything Abercrombie had intended, with unemployment rocketing. Abercrombie proposed much else which matters, and two things in particular. First, Heathrow Airport. Heathrow is not a historical accident. It was deliberately planned by Abercrombie to replace Croydon as London's international airport because it was sufficiently close to central West London to serve the capital's economy, while, in his view, being tolerable in its environmental impact. Abercrombie was also responsible for the new towns around London, from Stevenage in 1946 to Milton Keynes in 1967. Between them, the new towns now house 1.5 million people and are an integral part of London's wider region. The irony is that Abercrombie intended them to reduce London's economy. Now, the growth of London and the growth of the new towns feed off each other. So to the last 25 years, in many ways, the Ken and Hezza show. London has grown by 2 million, entirely reversing the post-World War II decline. Ken's legacy in staccato, Crossrail, Oystercard, Overground, congestion charge, the reinvention of London's buses, modernisation of the tube, a bold approach to new buildings, the Gherkin, the Shard, Heron Tower, championing the rights of gay people and ethnic minorities in this city long before it was politically mainstream. As for boldness, Ken was the only member of his own team who supported introducing the congestion charge in 2003. The others all thought he should drop it or put it off until his second term, when it wouldn't have happened. Since Ken, Boris has sold London as never before, but his policies are largely a continuation. As for Michael Heseltine, like the inscription on Wren's tomb, just look around you. None of this was here before, though I hasten to add Michael Heseltine is here and he isn't finished yet. Equally important to London's success in the past 25 years has been national government backing growth sectors, especially business services and the creative industries, and investing in public services. Inner London state schools transformed from among the worst to the best in Britain. London's universities racing ahead. The same true of health, transport and local services. And London's cultural institutions reborn and multiplied, thanks largely to the National Lottery. But big problems are still here, especially the challenges of growth and poverty. This is the score. We're building barely a third as many new homes as London needs. Yet there is no credible plan for the other 2/3, an extra 40,000 homes needed a year. In 17 boroughs, the average rent is now more than half the average wage, and the typical first-time buyer is 32. Peak congestion remains unbearable on much of central London's rail, tube and bus networks. Try getting on the Northern Line at Clapham any weekday morning. Our major international airport is full with a sign outside saying closed for new business, yet there is no transport plan for London after Crossrail opens in 4 years' time. East London ought to be the face of the future, yet the only way of getting across the Thames by road east of Tower Bridge is by 2 century-old tunnels, one of them, Bazalgette's Blackwall Tunnel, with its sharp bends, which he put there in 1897 to prevent the horses from bolting when they saw the daylight. There's no plan there either. And what of mass youth unemployment and the acute shortage of youth apprenticeships and technicians? The opportunities are still not there for a generation of teenagers. The girl in search of an apprenticeship in Hackney, the boy on his way to university from Haringey, they're equally valuable. Both need their opportunity. Last month, I spent a week on London's buses. 100 buses in 5 days, a whole day stationary on Oxford Street. The really mad bit was the Thursday night, starting with the clubs in Shoreditch at midnight, then to Trafalgar Square, ending up on the N9 to Heathrow, arriving at 4 a.m. I tell you, these night buses are extraordinary, part of the public service transformation I just talked about. 30 years ago, there were hardly any. Now they're everywhere, more than 60 routes every night, safe and reliable. I got chatting to other passengers, generally young, some out partying, but most of them going to and from work, bar and restaurant staff, cleaners, shop workers, nurses, some of Heathrow's 30,000 early shift workers on the N9. Almost all of them had moved to London from other parts of the country or from abroad. All of them loved London, and basically what they said was this: great city with the hope of a better life, but a constant struggle to make ends meet, which could easily fail. So again, in our generation, we face a choice between action and inaction to tackle the big problems of today: housing, skills, congestion, jobs. In some ways, it's harder to be bold than in the past. We aren't in the wake of a great fire or a cholera epidemic or eradicating the slums after wartime bombing. But how we act or fail to act in the decade ahead will decide whether London becomes one city or two, world city or declining city, the capital of congestion or the capital of opportunity. 2 futures for London. Now, I'm a professional optimist. Let's say we go for bold reform. Then here's London 2030. New city villages are London's great growth story. More than a dozen village communities of between 5,000 and 20,000 homes, each of them a good mix of houses, mid-rise and high-rise flats, typically half for rent, half for sale, creating vibrant, affordable communities across London, complete with schools, shopping, parks and leisure, cultural attractions, NHS hubs, and a new generation of care homes. Each of them distinct, reflecting local history and institutions, but all of them walkable, built around the bike, the bus and the train, not the car, and all made possible by new or improved rail links, putting them within half an hour of the centre. Woolwich Arsenal was the model for these city villages, part conversion of the old barracks, part riverside new build, which took off when Crossrail 1 was built with the new station at Woolwich Arsenal. But as a movement, the city villages weren't spontaneous. They came out of the great house price explosion of the mid-2010s, when house prices in London literally doubled over 5 years, yet home building increased by only a few thousand a year, while successive mayors and chancellors vacillated and wrangled. It was when the average London house price reached £600,000 and the newly launched TV channel London Live raised its famous petition of 2 million Londoners demanding 1 million homes by 2030 that action followed. Within a month, the Mayor and Prime Minister Ed Miliband agreed the 2016 growth deal for London, which gave the Mayor and the boroughs London's property and development taxes in return for a commitment to 1 million homes, and London undertaking to pay for most of the transport and other infrastructure needed to support them. What followed are the city villages now called the New Pearls of London, strung along Crossrail 1, Crossrail 2, which opened last year from Wimbledon and the southwest to Hackney and the northeast, and the 3 new bridges and tunnels in East London, which have made it as quick and easy to get from Bexley to Barking as from Putney to Chiswick. Many of you now live in Old Oak Common, Park Royal, Chessington View, Euston Park, Alexandra Palace Heights, Hackney Marshes, Hackney Wick, Upper Lee Valley, Lower Lee Valley, Royal Docks, Barking Reach. Most sought after of all are the award-winning Christopher Wren and Joseph Bazalgette city villages at the Abbey Wood end of Crossrail 1, developed by the Peabody Trust after knocking down much of the godforsaken Thamesmead estate, which the very old amongst you may remember was backdrop for the dystopian film Clockwork Orange, a byword for urban disaster 60 years ago, right back in the 1970s. Old Oak Common and Euston Park, which include HS2 stations, are hotspots for commuters to Birmingham and the north, particularly since the House of Lords moved to Leeds, and the MOD to Liverpool. The Scots are buying them up too, now that HS2 is being extended to Edinburgh and Glasgow. Education is world class. Stratford Science City, with its new Imperial, UCL and Queen Mary extension, is a buzz of academics and entrepreneurs. London's 30 new technical career colleges turn out 100,000 apprentice graduates a year, technicians indispensable to London's growth. Then there are the 300 new schools opened in the last decade to serve London's booming population of young families. All of them new model academies, another London-led reform, each offering something special as well as providing good general education. There are 50 bilingual academies. Chinese is especially popular, particularly in West London, around the expanded but far quieter Heathrow. More than 100 academies have a tech or digital mission, prime suppliers of talented teenagers to the expanding iCity and the Creative Arts campus at Shoreditch. London's cultural scene is richer and more cosmopolitan than ever. The huge new Arts and Theatre Quarter at King's Cross, around the iconic Gas Tower, the stunning new gallery at St James's Palace, which the King gave to the nation as a permanent exhibition of the Royal Collection, Kensington Palace, an amazing new concert venue, the Museum of Migration in the Olympic Village, now with more visitors than Tate Modern, Buckingham Palace Park, open to the public as an ever-changing exhibition of the Royal Horticultural Society. All this is why Newsweek's 2030 capital of the world is London. And this is what Newsweek said. The City and Canary Wharf dwarf Wall Street. Oxford and Regent Street excel Milan and Paris for shopping. Shoreditch and Hackney compete with Cannes and LA as the international home of the film community. iCity and Tech City are right up there with Silicon Valley for technological innovation. The most cosmopolitan metropolis in the world. And when people from all over this world think of a land of opportunity, they no longer think of the Statue of Liberty, but of Big Ben. Not that everything has been a success. The decision on Heathrow's 4th runway rumbles on. Cost overruns on the Central London tram are horrendous. Boris's extension of the cable car to Downing Street was a security nightmare. And it probably wasn't a good idea to try and extend Greater London's boundaries from Southampton to Northampton. Better to have stopped at Ebbsfleet and the 4 other new garden cities. So, London 2030. What shines through is the spirit of the Olympics. London leading the nation and best in the world. A spirit of unity, urgency, change. When Christopher Wren put his plan to Charles II, this is what he said. Nothing will more discover abroad the weakness of our government than that having an opportunity in their hands of doing one of the greatest benefits that can be done to the public, they are unable to bring it to pass or unwilling to be at the trouble. That was the challenge then. It is the challenge now. It is our choice. Thank you.
Right, I'm just here to cover the scene change while we put some chairs up on the platform. Thank you very much for that, Lord Adonis. That was a fantastic glimpse of one of our possible futures. If Lord Heseltine would like to reply, I shall introduce him. Not that he needs much introduction. He's just given an interview to the New Statesman, where he says we are going to join the euro one day, but we'll deal with that later, Michael. Do you want to come up here, and because we want to be ready to take questions after we've.
Well, thank you, and can I echo Andrew's words of gratitude to all those who have made this extremely full and distinguished audience possible. I said to Andrew when he kindly showed me a draft of the speech that I thought it was extremely distinguished and very thorough, and if there was an element of fantasy when he crossed into the projection of 2030, that is a political judgment he's entitled to make, but I would very much question the personalities that feature in his projection, some of them anyway. But I'm not going to speak for very long because, but there are one or two things that Andrew said that I think are interesting, particularly to me. The most interesting, in a way, was the bus journey. Now, how many politicians can spend a week immersing themselves day after day, and I understand night after night, in the ordinary way in which the vast majority of people live their lives? And that's how you learn to speak not just from the mind, but from the gut. You understand the problem. And that is a great tribute to a political colleague of a different party to me, who actually cares passionately and is totally informed on the subject about which he talks. The second lesson to me that comes out of what he said, and it complies completely with my philosophy, show me a problem, show me who's in charge. It is about people. It is about creating an opportunity that those with the vision, the cussedness, the determination, actually get their way. And Andrew, throughout history, showed how these willful, and I dare say some very unpleasant characteristics they possessed, actually were there at the moment and got their way. You were very generous in mentioning my role, very small, but to me interesting. But there is an aspect of it which perhaps is not so well known. And that is why I had the concept of a development corporation for the East End available to me in 1979. I was a junior minister under Graham Page from 1970 to 72, dealing with planning. And I believed that what we were doing on the south bank of the Thames was an absolutely unforgivable planning disgrace. An opportunity with one of the great urban waterscapes of the world. And we were putting up rows of buildings which, frankly, I found appalling. And so I said to one of my officials, look, I have a simple solution to this. Just like those guys that Andrew talked about. I'm going to take over the south bank of the Thames. And you just produce for me a draft parliamentary proposal that gives me the powers to become the arbiter of the quality of development on the South Bank. Well, they did, as they always do. Civil servants do as they are bid. The word got out, and I was reshuffled very rapidly to become Minister of Aerospace, often out of the country and out of sight. But of course, the last laugh was with me, because they didn't know, and I didn't know then, that in 1979, some 7 years later, I would be back in that self-same department. And the lunch I gave to my permanent secretary before I even entered the department was recorded on an envelope, the number one item of which was Development Corporation. But of course, it wasn't the left bank of the Thames, or the south bank of the Thames, it was the East End of London. And the story is now well known about the battles that took place to get that through. And I'm thrilled to see that Erik Sorensen, who was one of the chief executives, is here tonight. We had a lot of fun and a lot of excitement, and lots of things happened, not because I made them happen, but because other people were given the opportunity to make them happen. Nothing more conspicuous than this building. Now, my interest in being here tonight is not that I'm here to talk about London particularly. My preoccupation at this time of my life is to try and get central government to let go the reins of control and the disciplines of the functional monopoly that they enjoy, and to embrace the talents that lie across one end of this country to the other. There is a priority to which I personally subscribe, to rebalance Britain. But as part of rebalancing Britain, we need to reignite the enthusiasm for the Thames corridor. I believe that the Development Corporation was an essential vehicle for what was achieved here. But I don't believe the present arrangements measure the scale of opportunity that exists if we wish to exploit, and by that I don't mean sort of do something rather nasty behind the closed doors. I mean take the huge talent, the huge natural resources, the huge world position, and do it with vision and passion and determination and conviction. It will not be done if it is left to the existing arrangements which do not measure up to the scale of the opportunity or the challenge. Rebalancing? Yes. The Atlantic Gateway in the northwest, the great cities of Manchester and Liverpool, now actually working together to subscribe to the concept that they can seize an opportunity, whether it's the great port that is now being recreated, whether it's the airport, whether it is HS2, whether it is Media City. There is a balancing operation in place, but not yet as convincing as I believe it can be. But my present role associated with government, I'm not a minister, but I have an office in Whitehall, can you believe it, is to play a part in the implementation of the report that I was responsible for a year or two ago, called No Stone Unturned. And basically all that report said is to government, let go, listen to them, use the same amount of money, we all know there's no more money, use that money in partnership with the strengths that exist from one end of the country to the other. And I was partially successful in persuading the government. The result is that on Monday, this week, 39 local enterprise partnerships, the whole of England, put forward their proposals as to what they would do with £2 billion in the first year, but 20 billion over 6 or 5 years, what they would do to reignite their local economies. Now that has never happened in this country before. There has never been such an invitation or such a scale of opportunity. And I cannot tell you tonight, and nor can anybody else, what's even in those bids, because they've literally arrived on the stroke of midnight, one or two of them. But we will know, and in 3 months' time, the government will have decided what to do in response. And so in terms of reigniting local conviction and passion, building on the strengths and weaknesses of the local economies, there is underway a change of approach. And the danger in so many of these big changes in this country is that one government does it, the next one comes in and undoes it. Or worse still, comes in, undoes it, but then actually recreates it by putting different names to the people who were trying to do it with the inevitable 2 to 3 year gap in the momentum. But the present opposition, who I long wish happiness in their position, just to sort of just to separate us off, show there is a difference between us somewhere, have committed themselves to the maintenance of the local enterprise partnerships. And when you think that those local enterprise partnerships, 39 right across England, are a composite of some of our leading companies, representatives of our small companies, the leaders of virtually every significant local authority in the country, and the vice-chancellors of virtually every significant university, you realize that that degree of talent cannot be matched by civil servants thinking about transport or housing or education or whatever it may be in a Whitehall silo mentality. So there is a new world out there. I just hope that when I'm around to make this speech in 2030, I can prove to you that I was right. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Lord Heseltine. Tony Travers, Professor as well. What would you like to say?
Right. Well, first I'd like to thank George Jacobescu and the Canary Wharf Group for giving us such an unusual view of the Sahara Desert out here this evening, and I think it is Saharan sand that we're looking at out there. And also to add to Michael Heseltine's remark about the personalities that may or may not be mayor or whatever by the time we get to 2030, we can indeed, I'm sure, be certain that Lord Heseltine will still be giving urban advice about urban development by that point. That's one thing we can be sure of. Now, listening to what Andrew said this evening, I thought that there's no question that there are a number of key individuals who've been enormously important in making London what it is. Not just individuals, but institutions and occasionally just events. And I want to add one or two more, not to criticise Andrew's list, which I completely agree with, but just very briefly, I would add for the next edition of the speech, perhaps, never forget the City of London Corporation, whose miraculous, indestructible role in London tells you enormous amounts about how the place has evolved to today. As far as the transport system's concerned, Lord Ashfield and Frank Pick, the great, they picked up the rather bankrupt underground railway that Yerkes had left and turned it into the great combine that picked up the buses and made that system into what it is today. Herbert Morrison, a great Labour leader of the London County Council, the nearest that London probably had to a LaGuardia type figure. And then other odds and sods not to be forgotten. The Clean Air Act, undoubtedly, a great thing like the Victorian sewers. Remember all those anybody over about 55 in London, remember all the buildings used to be black and covered in soot. Now they are not, and the soot was very poisonous, not only to buildings. And the other thing I'd mention is the wave after wave of migrants to the city. And if I can just add a cautionary note, I do think there's a risk to London that because of national and other political events and international pressures, there is a risk to London in sending out, however accidentally, an anti-immigrant, an anti-foreign capital and an anti-foreigner message at the moment because of national politics and not because of London. The fact that today we've seen the first fall in modern times in the number of overseas students to the United Kingdom is not a great signal. And on the same day, I note Dubai has overtaken London Heathrow as the biggest international airport. So there are things we need to keep an eye on in terms of both the messages the country sends out and how we develop. But I just briefly want to say, to add to what Andrew said, history is hugely important to London because that history is part of what the city is, but also, of course, the city's capable of doing what I've wrote down here as hedonistic postmodern. That is, it can simultaneously do, you know, the Tower of London and the Beefeaters and all of that history, the Royal Parks, all this great stuff, and also be really attractive to young international migrants and young international tourists. And it does both these things in the same space at the same time, which is pretty good. The way we've structured our government cannot, this is my favourite subject, I have to say, cannot be ignored. It's a loose structure which explains a lot of what goes on out there with random interventions in the infrastructure. Probably enough infrastructure over time. It's not like Paris where everything's planned out years and years and years in advance. Perhaps a bit too planned occasionally. London doesn't do over-planning, but it does some planning, as Andrew has said, and that's very important in giving us the balance between the loose structure of the neighbourhoods and then the occasional interventions, Bazalgette, the Underground, and so on, across the whole city. The boroughs are, amazingly, given that not much lasts this long in Britain and British public life, 50 years old, just about. And they are both competitive and collaborative. And you can see the competitive collaborativeness in the tall buildings. There's a debate going on elsewhere in London tonight about tall buildings, about whether there should be fewer of them or more of them, or whether they should be clustered or what they should look like and so on. But actually where they're clustered, you can see from here where boroughs are, just by where the tall buildings are clustered. And that gives you a feel for the competitive, collaborative nature of the boroughs. They do some things competitively, they think very differently, they behave differently, and yet they allow us to choose where we want to live. If you want to live here, sort of Toronto-on-Thames, or, you know, sort of modern North American city, you can live here. If you want to look at here, you can go over there and look here. But if you want to live in an Italianate village, there's Kensington. And all these things are possible and much more besides in this one place. So I do think the fragmentation and the competition between the boroughs and the way the city has evolved in this flexible way is hugely important to making it the thing it is. 2 or 3 final points. We now have the powerful office of mayor. Andrew's talked about this, and who knows? Well, who knows? I mean, who knows might be mayor in future? What I'd say, though, is this. What a paradox. What a wonderful, joyful paradox. And Michael Heseltine, in particular, has lived through all elements of this paradox, that the abolition of the Greater London Council should have led to the creation of a more powerful office in its place. You know, on the be careful what you wish for principle, or perhaps it was exactly the right thing to do, in fairness to Mrs. Thatcher and others at the time, because in the end, it came right. So that's interesting. So the abolition of the GLC equals our new powerful mayoral system. But as the city grows, Andrew gave you the figures earlier on, it's an extraordinary rate of growth, probably faster in absolute terms even than in the 19th century. We will need more housing, as Andrew said. We will need more railways. In fact, we'll need more schools, we'll need more everything. And that will beg a serious question, because the mayor will have to assert greater control than the boroughs feel comfortable with in ensuring that the right number of houses are to be built, in driving through infrastructure. The more the city grows within its current boundaries, the bigger the population, in the end there will need to be more top-down government. Boroughs are never very keen on that. They like to defend their independence and their patches as they are, but it is inevitable. It is an inevitability as the city grows that there will need to be a bit more top-down, and that will have to be managed. It's something the boroughs and the mayor will be able to do, I'm sure, but we need to be conscious that this is what's happening. And finally, I couldn't end any speech of this kind without making the following point. If London is to be able to make better decisions about the future of its own investment, it needs, as a city, to be able to hold a larger proportion of the taxes that it generates. We live in the United Kingdom, or in England within the UK, in the most centralised of all the large democracies in the world. And one of the great things that we could next move on to is devolving more powers, more financial powers to London to allow the city to make decisions about its own destiny, and indeed Greater Manchester, the Leeds City region, the Liverpool City region as well. Absolutely agree with Michael Heseltine on that. It is an opportunity. I think London's shown the way, and it can continue to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tony. Which delightfully leaves us with 20 minutes for questions. You know the rules. Say who you are and keep it short. Those are the rules. Let's have... I think there probably is a roving microphone, but I'm sick of roving microphones. Just shout if you've got a decent voice. Charles Rice over there.
Thank you. I have a mic as it happens.
Oh,
is
right.
it working? Charles Rice, formerly Evening Standard. This has been touched on, but in a bit more detail. Would you like to see, to achieve the kind of vision you've spelt out, more powers from government to London's mayor? If so, what might they be? And just by the by, if we ever have a situation where we've got Prime Minister Miliband and Mayor Farage, how might that work?
Andrew.
I'm completely with Tony in his report. We've got to have significantly additional resources for the mayor, and I think that there's a deal to be done. The deal is that London gets more of its tax base in return for taking more responsibility for providing its infrastructure, including its housing. That's the deal. And the really striking thing about Tony's report is that if he went to the whole extent of his recommendations, which are quite radical in terms of business rates and a whole set of other taxes which will be devolved to London, the proportion of London's tax, which then stays in London, goes up from 8% to 12%?
Absolutely, 12, 13.
8% to 12, 13%. Now, only, what's the equivalent figure in New York? 50% plus, in almost every other city,
50,
it's higher still. So the deal is not only a deal which is good for London, but if this drives growth, which is the purpose of it, as well as dealing with London's problems so far as central government is concerned, it's a fantastic deal for the Treasury too, because 88% of the taxes which are raised continue to go to the Treasury, including huge additional taxes that will come from a booming London. So I think Tony makes a really compelling argument. Now, what's interesting about it is that I thought when I first read his report, great for London, how are you going to sell it to all those other cities that Michael Heseltine was talking about? And I did a dinner soon after with the leaders of what are called the core cities, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool and so on, and said, what do you think about this? Is this something in the realm of the possible for you, or is it going to be bad for you because it's just seen as more London? They bit my head off. I had the leader of Manchester City Council telling me that Manchester had grown more than London in the last 10 years in terms of population. The leader of Birmingham saying that though he hadn't grown by quite as much, he fully intended to over the next 10 years, and he had his own plans too. And they absolutely wanted control of more of their own tax base too, because this would enable them to plan much more effectively their own infrastructure and take a great deal more responsibility for it. So my own view is that the agenda which both Tony and Michael set out is the inevitable agenda if we're going to accept that cities are the leaders of growth in the nation at large. And that isn't just about London, it's about the other cities too. And that must lead, over time, I can't say what time and what stage of the Ed Miliband premiership this will take place in, but over time, it must lead to a new fiscal settlement between central government and the cities.
Yeah.
I would just like to say that the mayoralty you forecast and the premiership you describe would be time for me to devote my energies to the great renaissance of the planet in the sky.
I don't know. Andrew Adonis hasn't even been elected mayor yet, and he wants more powers. Bill Keegan at the back there.
Thank you, John. First of all, thank you, everybody, for a fantastic presentation. I'd just like to ask each speaker individually to say what he has to the reaction, what reaction he has to the piece that appeared in my newspaper on Sunday by my colleague Rowan Moore about all the tall buildings that are being planned for London. Do you really want to see all these? Can't we control this?
Tony?
Well, there was just a slight sense of if only we controlled the skyline, if I may say so, then it would be all right, as there always is with these kind of things. And the truth is that, as this area proves, London can undoubtedly take towers. This area, the great thing about Canary Wharf, and I'm not saying this just because we're sitting in one of their buildings, is it's planned. It was properly planned. It looks good wherever you look at it from. And that does show how planning can work. So I'm actually personally not against tall buildings, but I prefer them to be rather more corralled and like this group here, in a sense where you can see what you're looking at. The whole thing is planned. And that's, you know, I'm not just being flattering to our hosts, I actually believe that.
Lord Heseltine, what do you think of tall buildings?
I'm basically, within the planning constraints, I'm in favour of more tall buildings. But one of the interesting things about this particular experiment, it was a combination of a development corporation and an enterprise zone. And the view about the enterprise zone was let everything flow, you know, get rid of the regulations and let anything happen to get jobs. But the executives and council of the development corporation refused to do that. What they said was, no, we're going to have tighter, tougher quality controls on what we did. And of course, the Canary Wharf development completely complied with that, as opposed to the free-for-all that enterprise zones were designed to produce.
Andrew, do you want to?
I'm strongly in favour of beautiful tall buildings and strongly against ugly tall buildings. But I wouldn't at the moment want to offer comment on which ones I regard as being in which category.
Next question. Sorry, at the back there? Yes, you, sir.
Owen Joseph. I would just like to ask, do you think it's possible to solve London's housing crisis without building much more truly affordable public housing? I mean, Tony says we could come and live in Canary Wharf or Kensington if we wanted, but most of us could not because we couldn't afford the prices. And is that going to require, if we do it, public money rather than private money?
Who wants to kick off?
Well, it'll require both. It'll require both. And there's huge opportunity for private investment in infrastructure, transport infrastructure. Not everybody can live in the most desirable parts of London. That'll never change. It never has changed. It's always been the position. But so we need more housing. Let it be financed both in the public and the private sector. But the more it can be in the private sector, the less strain there is on the taxpayer.
I mean, the truth, I mean, this isn't meant to sound complacent, but it is worth remembering that even in the late 1970s, and certainly Eric and Barry and Quirk and others in the audience remember this, even then, when the population of the city was falling towards, well, under 7 million and was heading for 6 at the time, there was still a chronic housing crisis with chronic homelessness. And my slight fear about, I mean, we will have to build lots and lots and lots more housing, but my slight fear is that when we do that, it'll just fill up faster and we'll always be chasing and there'll always be this problem. So I can't offer you the certainty that if we suddenly built 2 million houses, there would, or 2 million homes, there would then not be a housing crisis. My suspicion is there'd still be a housing crisis. That's not meant to be complacent, just a statement of what it looks like over time.
I think that's the opposite of complacent, isn't it? We're
Thank
doomed
you, John.
forever.
Thank you, John. Oh, yes.
Andrew, it's very striking if you look back at the numbers. When we were last building more than 300,000 homes a year, which is in the 1960s, the peak being 430,000 in 1967, it was almost exactly half councils and registered social landlords and half private sector. So to get to those kind of numbers, I think you do need to have a fairly equal balance between the two. I'm also very struck that the peak year for house building since the war was 1967, which is also the last year that the state designated a new town, Milton Keynes. And the point about new towns, which I think is significant, is not only the numbers involved. The numbers involved, you take the collective of the new towns after the war, was very large, but of course still a minority of the housing. It's what it says about the mentality of the state, that a state that is itself prepared to become planner-in-chief in designing new settlements, taking on very great controversies in terms of designating new settlements, is the same one that's also going to empower the local authorities and the cities and will create an environment in which the private sector gets going too. So I think it needs to be a partnership, as I see it, between registered social landlords, local authorities, the private sector and the state itself.
Okay, I want to get some more questions in, so let me take 3 questions, which must be the right thing to do because Tony Blair used to do it. George Jones.
George Jones, Professor Queen Mary. not one of you has mentioned the word policing. Is that because you think in the future utopia, police will not be needed?
Who else wants to ask? In the middle here, blue shirt.
In the national politics, you often hear London as a pejorative term to attack sort of the rich and the elite. Do you think there's the political will to really let London get loose and reach 2030?
And who else wanted a question? Here, yes, this gentleman.
Nigel White. A historical question, but Andrew Adonis mentioned the post-war decline of London, which was partly to the Abercrombie report. I remember from my reading of the Abercrombie report, a lot of it was never implemented. In particular, the sort of recommendations on zonal planning, the radical restructuring of the road network, all that never happened. Do you think the world London would be very different today had the Abercrombie report been implemented in full?
Andrew.
Well, was it 5 ring roads? How many was it? 5? I think London would have been quite different if they'd all gone ahead, and I think it's a good thing for London that they didn't, and zonal planning would have been different too. So clearly it would have been different if the full report had been implemented. What I find so striking reading it, though, is how much of it was implemented. Indeed, if you look at the appendices which set out where the new towns should be located and the extended towns, a surprisingly large proportion of those happened, and it reinforces my view that in politics and policy, the person who has the plan is remarkably powerful. People massively overestimate how important the presentational side of politics is. Very few people in politics are seriously engaged in the business of policy development, and those who manage to put it together into a plan, and the Abercrombie plan is 2 really substantial volumes, often have the last word. On the issue of policing, the reason I didn't highlight it is, thank goodness, I mean, this may change, who knows, but it's not, the reform of policing isn't as urgent an issue for London as the supply of new housing. I don't see it as in that category, but of course we could easily have put in the list Sir Robert Peel and the development of London policing in the 19th century, where the bearing down on really appalling levels of crime and social violence was in some ways as big as what Bazalgette did.
Lord Hasseltine, do you want to?
Well, the policing is critical, and it's a great source of regret that there's such a cloud over tiny parts of present policing, which has done much to shake public confidence. I'm sure the police are as concerned as all of us to put that right. But policing, absolutely fundamental. The reason we didn't mention it is because basically this is about regeneration. We really haven't talked much about education or skills or all these other things which are very important. On the question of whether the government will allow these things to happen, the problem for governments of the nation state is that they are increasingly losing power because the forces at large in the world are now above the nation state. And including in that is international capitalism. If you want jobs, you have to get investment. Investment is in the hands of international men and women who either have a fiduciary responsibility to their pensioners or to their insurance companies, whatever it is, or they are investors in their own name as private sector companies. And so they will only come here if the climate is acceptable. And if they don't come here, you won't have jobs. And if you won't have jobs, you won't get elected. So the answer to your question is, don't worry, it'll be all right. And the third question was about the Abercrombie report, which, needless to say, like virtually every other report on the subject I talk about, I haven't read. But I would just say one thing. Don't be so sure that the car and congestion are here to stay. I have a sort of funny old feeling, it's a sort of, a sniff, that actually the coming of the electronic age will lead to urban transport being hireable. A bubble, you want to go somewhere, you press a button, a bubble arrives at your door, you get in it, you program it, it goes back into the pool, and someone else uses it. And so the idea that everyone, all these growing populations and all the people coming to London are going to bring cars in, I think that in 20 or 30 years' time, you may find that the technological revolution has overtaken that.
Very good. Tony?
Well, of course, George, if I hadn't mentioned Herbert Morrison, you just said nobody mentioned Herbert Morrison, so that's why that time was what I'd have spent on the police. Seriously, I think there is a question about police accountability, not only in London. I'm unique in Britain in feeling there needs to be a bit more political accountability for the police, but most people in Britain think that chief constables and the commissioner alone should be responsible for operational policing, and that is difficult when there are problems if the police themselves can't be forced or brought to tackle them. And that's, I think, the difficulty we have, that I think probably now we have a Mayor of London, we can go a bit further towards police accountability for policing without entirely allowing the Mayor to determine exactly who is chased through the streets, as it were. So I think police accountability is an issue that we'll need looking at, not just in London. Is London pejorative? I think, oddly enough, the core cities, and Andrew hinted at this, are much less pejorative about London than they once were. I'm not saying that outside London people don't see London as too rich and too successful and takes all the resources. That narrative has always been there and is still there. But I don't think anybody seriously any longer believes that making London poorer would make the rest of the country richer, and that's a big step. And then on Abercrombie, I mean, you know, Abercrombie, the best of one of the many, of all the things the internet has done and YouTube has done, allowing us to look at Patrick Abercrombie talking about his plan, which you can easily find with his monocle and, you know, telling us what the working man needs in London. Very, very well-intentioned, but crucially, a bit too much planning in a city that doesn't need or like too much planning. So I agree with you, he didn't get as far as he might have done.
Okay, one quick last round of questions. There's a gentleman in the middle there. Then we'll come to you.
Thank you. Dermot Finch from the Prince's Trust. I just wanted to pick up on Andrew's earlier point about schools and the transformation of inner London school performance over the last 10 years or so. Inner London schools now have got GCSE results that are, you know, way up there, way better than they were about 10 years ago. That's great for those who are doing well, but there's still a lot who aren't doing well in those inner London schools. What does the panel think about young people coming out of the school system in inner London and outer London who aren't able to access the jobs that London's creating?
Okay.
Andrew Keckwick. When do you expect London to extend from Southampton to Northampton, then onwards to Northumbria?
Oh, sorry. Okay, yes, you, sir, at the back.
Hi there, I'm Sebastian Payne from The Spectator. I was wondering a question for Lord Adonis and Lord Heseltine. When can we expect to see this speech in a mayoral manifesto, and would Lord Heseltine vote for that?
Very good. Lord Heseltine.
A serious speech in a mayoral manifesto. Well, until I read the speech, I can't tell you that I'd vote for it. And I can think of candidates whose speech it's almost inconceivable I would vote for. But, you know, I don't understand really what the question is. So I've done my best to waffle my way through, as every politician does. But there was another question.
A question about schools?
Schools, now this is one that, yeah. Well, look, I have a very simple starting point. This country has now slipped to 21 in the World League of Educational Standards. I won't go on about it. It is unacceptable, and it is merely a continuation of a pattern which began to develop in Victorian England and which we have not tackled effectively ever since. The other statistic, government statistic, 20% of the kids coming out of our schools are illiterate or innumerate by today's standards. That is a scandal. My simple solution, but they are often the best, that I think that a letter should go to the governors of every underperforming school, the names of which are published, saying, you have got 3 months in which to tell us what you intend to do, including change the head teacher. Because in my humble experience of this problem, which is not the biggest experience, but it's not insignificant, the solution is always to change the head teacher. And we want to know what you're going to do in 3 months' time. And if you don't satisfy us, then we will deal with use the powers that either central government or local authority, education authorities have got. This is something that is so urgent, so fundamental to our future, such a scandal to the young kids who are not given a chance in life because the education system fails them. We know where the schools are, and within the schools they know where the kids are that are going to come out unsuited for modern employment. And it is, I mean, you know, you've just got to change the head teachers and change the governors till you get the results.
Tony.
Well, I mean, Andrew mentioned the London challenge. There's no doubt London schools have gone from being, in many ways, the worst in the country to the best in the country in a very short time. I'm also intrigued myself, I'm not sure there's research about this, about how far immigration has probably helped this process. The arrival of large numbers of families with children who see London schools as a way of getting on fast must have changed some of helped in the attempt to drive the quality of education up. But that always begs the question of then a left behind part of the population who remain the most difficult to help. On the question of Southampton to Northampton and on to Northumbria, it won't happen, will it? No. I mean, one of the many things that, we also, Britain, not very good at planning. Well, actually, one thing we were good at was the Green Belt. One of the most successful bits of planning ever in any country, frankly. But that has consequences itself. I think it's going to be very hard to build new towns. Remember this, Milton Keynes has the same population of the borough in which we are sitting, and it covers 15 times the ground. Okay, that's what happens. You're going to have a lot of Milton Keyneses over quite a long time. And I just look forward to, probably Lord Heseltine could do this, be the person who went to draw the dotted lines on Buckinghamshire and Hertfordshire, which would become the new towns out there. But what all of this means, the protection of Greenland, difficulty of building new towns, except Ebbsfleet and within London in the Thames Estuary, is it will mean that London's population will almost certainly rise to 10 and then 11 million as the UK population rises, and then beyond that. And that's going to require the kind of planning that I was hinting at earlier, from the top down, more difficult for the boroughs than they've normally been used to, and that would be a challenge for all.
Challenge for you.
I'm always an optimist. We've already designated the first new town, Ebbsfleet. The heavens
haven't. That's already designated.
The heavens,
the new ones.
The heavens haven't. Oh no, but it was. No, it's very important. Ebbsfleet wasn't designated as a new town. What it had was a planning permission for 15,000 houses, virtually none of which have been built.
But you take the point about bits of Hertfordshire and Buckinghamshire.
Yeah, well, I think
it's difficult to get a strip for a railway through Buckinghamshire.
Start with the areas that want them, and there's a lot of East London that wants them. And if also one of my hobby horses at the moment, if we get building bridges and crossings across the Thames in East London and further east, so it's actually possible to develop this area. I think significant housing and really worthwhile communities could be developed. So I'm more of an optimist there. I've never believed that changing local authority boundaries was a worthwhile pursuit. In all my experience, and Tony and I have written a book about this in the past, huge political energy goes in redrawing lines on maps. You maximise opposition, because any change you make gets some people opposed, particularly if they think they're going to move into a borough where they're going to pay more tax, and that would almost certainly be the case if they're moving into London. And meanwhile, nothing happens. What you have is a complete blight across the whole system. So that was, just to be clear for my journalist friends in the audience, that was a joke. Southampton. It was not a serious proposition, and no mayor who is a friend of mine is going to be proposing big changes to London's boundaries. Now, this issue of schools, let's be optimistic again. The change in London schools over the last 50 years, people would not have thought was possible. You know, Hackney, which used to be a byword for total disaster in education, people now move into Hackney to go to the secondary schools, whereas they used to move as far away as they could get in order to leave them 10 years ago. A whole string of new academies, the City Corporation was mentioned earlier, the City Corporation and others who are giving really serious and inspirational leadership and big investment. The other big thing that's changed in London is that London has become the place to teach. You know, Teach First, which is one of the best things that's happened to London, let alone London education in the last 10 years, 1,500 new graduates, all with good degrees, coming into Teach First this year. 7 applicants per post. 7 applicants per post, whereas before Teach First you were lucky if you had even 1 in many secondary subjects, particularly in science subjects. And this is the really telling statistic. London was the place which, London's comprehensives to be more precise, were the place people wanted to avoid teaching at all costs, even those that went into teaching 15 years ago. Of this year's recruits to Teach First, 60% expressed a first preference to teach in London. Now, if you can do all of that in 15 years' time, I think we can be optimistic about what I see as the next big challenge, which is what happens to those who are not on track to go to university. That is not just a London problem, it's a national problem, and it can only be solved by a transformation in the quality and quantity of youth apprenticeships. Now, I've always taken the view in policy that a lot of it is R&D, rob and duplicate. Half of Europe, Michael mentioned going back to the Victorians. Since the Victorians, half of Europe has had perfectly good youth apprenticeship systems. I hate to mention it, but the Germans, they've been doing it for 150 years. And I think what we should do is a bit more rob and duplicate on youth apprenticeships. It should be the expectation that employers take young people and train them. And what our schools should be doing is, as well as, and our London schools should take the lead in this, as well as supplying students to go on to universities. We have 22 universities in London. They do a brilliant job. They should be paying equal attention and giving equal emphasis to equipping them to go into apprenticeships. And all of our employers, beginning with the Prince's Trust, which does great work in this area, but led Canary Wharf and these employers within a few yards of this building, should be taking as many apprentices as they take graduates. If we do that, we'll have solved our problem.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Sorry, we're well over time. All I could say is that you have definitely learned a lot more here than you would have done if you'd been watching Clegg versus Farage, which was the rival attraction. So can I just say thank you very, very much to all our speakers, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Gary. Well done. That was very good. He's absolutely right. I'd rather have my arm cut off than